The world is made up of beautiful, intricate details. It's natural to want to capture all of them, especially with watercolors because they offer us such a unique, soft and fluid way to illustrate nature. Of course, it can feel a bit overwhelming, like when you're trying to paint a very small, intricate subject. You may not know where to start or how to handle those tiny lines with your brush. In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint this dragonfly step by step and cover 5 strategies and techniques that will help you approach a painting like this without feeling overwhelmed. You will see that the process can be broken down into digestible steps, and we can actually skip a lot of the detail without sacrificing the sense of realism, and at the end capture the most essential and natural effects. Tip number 4, where I paint the lines on the wings, is probably the most important one if you want to understand the process of simplifying lines and shapes on paper, but do watch the whole process. And before we start, I wanted to point out for balance that sometimes full scientific accuracy is important. When I make illustrations for Canadian money, these flowers I design end up on silver and gold coins, and my illustrations are carefully vetted by scientific experts to make sure that I capture every single detail. I often have to make multiple revisions, counting down every stamen and every petal to arrive at 100% accurate depiction of every element. But this is very much an exception to the rule. In traditional representational art, something that I enjoy doing and teaching, there's a lot more room for simplification and abstraction without losing the overall realistic effect. So let's go back to the table and talk about tip number 1. You will find the link to the reference photo and my full list of watercolor materials in the video description below. As always, you can join me on Patreon if you prefer to paint along in real time, and if you want to download extra reference materials like step-by-step photos and black and white outlines. So you may be tempted to start working on those intricate veins on the wings, or maybe capture the dark legs, but I want you to pause and consider the background colors. No matter how small and detailed your subject is, you should always start with a light map of color. Capture the overall shape of the subject you're about to paint and cover the main areas with some very light pigments. So this is our foundation, and everything we add on top of this first layer will land perfectly if we get the first step right. We will be painting around these lighter blue colors in the next step using negative painting technique, revealing the light spots. But I will come back to this in a minute. For now, let's just cover it all, and I'm working with 2 main pigments, a creamy cobalt teal and a more intense phthalo blue-green shade. And you can see that I'm watering both of these pigments down quite a bit. If you look at the value scale, I'm staying somewhere around step 2 or 3, so very light values because I want to leave enough room for 1 or maybe even 2 layers on top of this. The wings will need some color as well. Even though they're transparent, there is some weight there, so the light won't pass through all the way. It makes sense to add the lightest possible tint, much lighter than the body of the dragonfly. And you can use any color here. I decided to add a bit of violet to my blue because the dragonfly is sitting on top of the violet pink sweet pea flowers. So adding this hue is helping me create some continuity in my palette, but you can stick to your initial blue pigment. My main tip here is related to shadows that are present even on the lightest shapes. In this case, notice the light will inevitably reflect against the wings, making some areas a bit darker than others, particularly around the base and the tip of each wing. You can drop a slightly darker pigment there, wet on wet, and the wing will instantly look more realistic because it will acquire a little bit more of a 3-dimensional shape effect. In fact, if you do this right, you can stop overworking the wings and skip all the intricate veins and still maintain a sense of realism. This is exactly what I did on the smaller study version of this dragonfly, where I simply couldn't capture all the veins with my brush. So I painted some deliberate shadows on the back wings and didn't follow with any veins on top. It still looks nice, and it actually took less time. So my key point here is try to capture the shadows before you capture the details, and you can skip a lot of the unnecessary brushwork while still maintaining a fairly realistic effect. In this much larger version, I think I will be able to add veins throughout, and I will show you how I did it. But for now, finishing this background layer is key. Notice that I'm trying to leave a thin white strip without any color. This is optional, but it will help me separate the two sides of the wing visually. In other words, I'm painting the top and the bottom as two separate shapes, leaving a little bit of room in between. Tip number 3 for painting overwhelming details is to use negative painting technique to create lighter shapes. In this step, we can finally start adding the details, and this is where negative painting technique comes to the rescue. It's my favorite watercolor technique. You know, if you've seen any of my previous videos, I use it all the time in portraits, in botanical art. It is really a lifesaver for small, light details. So those small light blue spots on the tail of the dragonfly, they're not easy to capture with watercolor because we can't really paint them on top of the dark blue because watercolors simply don't work that way. We always have to paint light to dark. And so our best option is to paint around these light blue spots. You can see that I'm working with the same phthalo blue pigment, but now slightly more saturated. I'm applying it around the light blue spots with the tip of my brush. We don't need to capture them all exactly the way they appear in the reference photo. It's much easier and more effective to notice the general logic of how these spots are arranged and capture what is possible. I'm painting on 12 by 12 inches arches block. At the scale, I'm able to capture one elongated white spot on top of every section of the dragonfly's tail, and maybe a much larger one in the center, where I will also add a few small dots with the tip of my brush for some texture. Notice in my smaller study, I simplified this process even more, capturing for the most part just one larger light blue shape in the center of each link or each tail section. I made the whole thing a lot less detailed, but I didn't lose the overall effect. And this is the key learning that I wanted to keep reinforcing in this video. Our goal in every painting is to capture the overall logic of the thing we're painting, to recreate the visual effect, not the full extent of the intricate detail. Unless, of course, you're going after photorealism, in which case we would need to blow this up at least 4 times and then really focus on capturing every intricate spot. Similarly, on the body of the dragonfly, I will apply the negative painting technique to paint around a few lighter lines that separate the main segments on the surface. It all looks kind of like an armor to me, so several darker plates on top of the dragonfly's back. And notice that I'm not trying to capture all of them. The key element here, in my opinion, is the line that goes along the spine, separating the back into 2 symmetrical segments with 2 elongated round shapes on top. If I'm able to capture more, I will. Those are the main things, the main shapes that are visible from a distance, and those are the ones that I want to focus on. Our last step is the veins on the wings, and this is where we get to talk about the most important principle of simplification and painting the details. I'm talking about painting the effect of the detail, the overall pattern, not the actual detail. So if you look closely at the lines I'm putting down, you will notice that I'm not capturing every single one, but rather 2 main types of lines. Long horizontal veins that start at the base of each wing and run all the way towards the edge, and smaller vertical ones that connect the longer veins. I can see right away that I won't be able to fit all these veins with my brush, so I focus on the overall pattern, starting with just a few longer lines, as many as I can comfortably fit in, and then adding smaller connecting veins, again only as many as I'm able to fit with the tip of my brush. So there's a pattern, long lines and shorter lines, connecting them, and I'm simply following this pattern to the best of my ability without getting overwhelmed with too much detail. Another important consideration is making sure that your overall pattern fits the perspective. In other words, we're aware that the wings are not flat. We're seeing them from different angles. And so I direct my brush strokes to fit that perspective, adjusting the angle of my brush and changing the distance between the lines according to the angle I'm looking from. In the smaller study version, I completely skipped the veins on the back of the wings without sacrificing much in terms of the overall effect. As I always say, adding more detail makes an object appear closer, so having no veins on the faraway wings simply reinforces the sense of perspective. The main point I want you to take away is that you don't need to feel stuck and frustrated over some tricky lines. As long as you notice and study the overall patterns, you can selectively recreate them on paper and skip everything else. Like I skipped all those lines and dots on the back of the dragonfly. I don't think they add much at all, and we can get rid of them completely. So I kept showing you my smaller study dragonfly to illustrate the main concepts throughout this video, and I wanted to highlight this as my tip number 5. A small study will always simplify the process down the road, adding a lot more clarity to your decisions. You may think it's a waste of time, and I completely get it. Sometimes I just want to sit down and paint something and not think too hard about the fundamentals or getting every shape and every color correctly. This is obviously the greatest joy in our creative process, painting intuitively, and I totally get it. But studies and preparation do come in very handy when you want to overcome a particular challenge or develop a skill that you can later apply in your other work without giving it much thought, so it kind of becomes second nature. And I added the small dragonfly to a much smaller blue orchid painting, which I did as a larger tutorial later on to showcase a different technique for painting flowers. This technique is called wet on damp, and you will also find this video on my YouTube channel. It was very challenging to paint such a small dragonfly, but it taught me everything I needed to know so I could paint a larger version with confidence and include it in a different composition. The last thing I'm going to mention, because it is quite important, and is that all these concepts that I just took you through are not limited to watercolor. These are fundamental principles that apply to any medium. In fact, there's an excellent video I stumbled upon recently that talks about the same fundamentals but in the context of black and white drawing. It's from Stephen Travers. Hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, and I will leave a link to this video below because I think it will be a really nice complement to this one. It will help you better understand the concepts that I discussed, maybe from a different perspective, using landscape and architectural drawings. And I'm also well aware that many of you are interested in improving your drawing skills as much as watercolor skills, so this video and the channel in general will be of value for sure. I hope you will find it interesting. And next week, I'm going to show you how I painted these sweet pea flowers, and we will talk about how to apply the concept of color temperature to improve your watercolor art. In the meantime, you can check out the Blue Orchids video if you are interested in learning more about wet on damp technique. Have a beautiful day. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I will see you next week.